Berlin, May 1945. The guns have finally stopped. Across the shattered ruins of the Third Reich, over 45,000 Soviet T-34 tanks sit motionless. Their engines still warm from the final assault. Tracks caked in the mud of 100 battlefields, shell casings scattered beneath their turrets like fallen leaves. These machines had broken the back of the Wehrmacht, crushed Hitler's panzer divisions, and rolled through the gates of the Reichstag. They were the most produced tank in human history, symbols of Soviet industrial might, and the instrument of Nazi Germany's destruction. But as victory celebrations erupted across Europe, these thousands of battle-scarred machines faced an uncertain future. The soldiers climbed down from their hatches for the last time. Officers gave final orders. Maintenance crews performed one last inspection. And then, slowly, deliberately, the greatest tank force ever assembled began to disappear. Some were driven east, back toward the Soviet Union. Others remained where they stopped, abandoned in German fields and forests. Within months, tens of thousands of T-34s would vanish from the landscape of post-war Europe. The war was over, but a new mystery was just beginning. What really happened to the Soviet T-34 tanks after the guns fell silent? To understand the scale of what happened next, you need to grasp the enormous of Soviet T-34 production. Between 1940 and 1945, Soviet factories produced over 84,000 T-34 tanks. Even after accounting for battlefield losses, mechanical failures, and vehicles destroyed during the German invasion, the Red Army possessed more than 45,000 operational T-34s when Germany surrendered. This represented the largest concentration of armored vehicles in world history. They sat in tank parks from Prague to Berlin, from Vienna to Budapest. Each one a 26-ton machine of welded steel, armed with an 85mm gun, capable of speeds up to 55 kilometers per hour. They had earned their reputation through blood and fire, winning battles at Kursk, Stalingrad, and Operation Bagration. But Joseph Stalin had a problem. A massive, expensive problem. Each T-34 required fuel, maintenance, spare parts, and trained crews. The Soviet economy, devastated by 4 years of total war, was hemorrhaging resources. 27 million Soviet citizens had died. Entire cities had been reduced to rubble. Farmland across Ukraine and Belarus lay scorched and mined. The Soviet Union was victorious but economically broken, and maintaining 45,000 tanks was an impossible burden for a nation that could barely feed its people. Something had to be done with these machines, and it had to be done quickly. In the summer of 1945, orders came down from Moscow. The immediate fate of the T-34 force would be decided by cold arithmetic. Soviet quartermasters conducted a massive inventory across occupied Eastern Europe. Each tank was inspected and categorized. Vehicles with less than 500 engine hours and minimal battle damage were marked for retention. These would return to the Soviet Union to equip the peacetime Red Army. Tanks with moderate damage but repairable engines were designated for reserve status or transfer to satellite states. Everything else, tens of thousands of battle-worn machines, were condemned. They would be stripped for parts, melted down for scrap, or simply abandoned where they stood. The destruction began almost immediately. In tank depots across Poland and eastern Germany, Soviet engineers organized the largest scrapping operation in military history. Picture rows of T-34s stretching to the horizon, hundreds of them lined up in former Wehrmacht tank parks. Crews moved methodically from vehicle to vehicle. First, they removed anything valuable: optical sights, radios, ammunition, machine guns. These components were crated and shipped east. Then came the fuel and lubricants drained into barrels for reuse. Finally, demolition teams placed explosive charges inside the turrets. The goal wasn't to destroy the tanks completely, but to render them permanently inoperable, preventing their potential use by enemies or black market scavengers. The explosions echoed across the German countryside throughout late 1945 and early 1946. Each detonation gutted a tank from within, warping the turret ring and cracking the hull. The burned-out hulks were then collected by Soviet railway battalions and transported to hastily established scrapyards. In places like Cottbus and Magdeburg, enormous fields filled with destroyed armor. German civilians, conscripted as laborers, used cutting torches to reduce the tanks to manageable pieces of steel. The metal was loaded onto trains and shipped back to Soviet foundries in the Urals. The same steel that had been forged into weapons of liberation would be melted down and reborn as tractors, construction equipment, and eventually new tanks. But not all T-34s met this fate. Stalin recognized that Soviet power would require allies, and those allies would need weapons. Throughout 1946 and 1947, thousands of T-34s were transferred to the newly established communist governments of Eastern Europe. Poland received approximately 4,000 tanks, becoming the first foreign nation to operate the T-34 in large numbers. Czechoslovakia, with its advanced industrial base, received 3,500 vehicles, along with the technical documentation to produce their own. Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary each received between 500 and 1,000 tanks. These weren't gifts of goodwill. Each transfer came with strict conditions. Soviet advisors would train the crews, Soviet doctrine would govern their deployment, and ultimately, these tanks served Moscow's strategic interests in occupied Europe. The pattern repeated across Asia. As communist movements gained strength in China and Korea, Stalin opened his arsenals. Between 1947 and 1950, over 2,000 T-34s were shipped to the Chinese Communist forces under Mao Zedong. These tanks arrived by rail through Manchuria, still bearing the scars and markings of European battles. Chinese crews received hasty training from Soviet instructors before deploying the vehicles in the final campaigns of the Chinese Civil War. In photographs from 1949, you can see T-34s rolling through Beijing's streets during victory parades, their crews wearing uniforms that mixed Soviet and Chinese elements, symbols of the expanding communist bloc. Then came Korea, and the T-34 entered a second war. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel with 258 Soviet-supplied T-34-85 tanks leading the invasion. These machines, veterans of Berlin and Budapest, now fought on the rice paddies and mountain roads of the Korean peninsula. For the first weeks of the war, they were nearly unstoppable. American and South Korean forces had virtually no anti-tank weapons capable of penetrating the T-34's armor. The tanks smashed through defensive positions, crushed infantry with their tracks, and created a refugee crisis as hundreds of thousands fled south. It wasn't until American forces deployed M26 Pershing tanks and newer anti-tank weapons that the T-34 dominance ended. The tables turned at battles like Pusan Perimeter and Incheon, where superior American tactics and firepower destroyed dozens of North Korean T-34s. The wreckage of those Korean War T-34s tells its own story. Even today, rusted hulks remain scattered across the Korean peninsula, too remote or too dangerous to recover. Some sit in demilitarized zones, gradually being consumed by vegetation. Others were salvaged by South Korean forces and studied extensively. American intelligence officers crawled through captured T-34s, measuring armor thickness, examining welding techniques, testing the quality of Soviet steel. The information gathered from these Korean battlefield captures influenced Western tank design for decades. NATO engineers learned to respect the T-34's sloped armor concept, its wide tracks for mobility, and its simple but effective mechanical design. But some of the strangest T-34 stories emerged far from conventional battlefields. In 1950, Israeli forces discovered something unexpected in the Egyptian Sinai: T-34 tanks. The Soviet Union, playing both sides in the emerging Middle East conflicts, had supplied Egypt with several hundred T-34s as part of an arms deal. These tanks, which had fought Nazi Germany alongside Western allies just 5 years earlier, were now pointed at Israel. During the 1956 Suez Crisis, Israeli forces captured dozens of Egyptian T-34s, pressed them into service, and used them against their former owners. You can still see some of these captured vehicles today in Israeli military museums, marked with both Soviet Red Stars and Israeli Defense Force insignia, a bizarre testament to Cold War geopolitics. Africa became another unlikely destination. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, thousands of T-34s were transferred to African nations as the Soviet Union competed with the West for influence during decolonization. Countries like Somalia, Ethiopia, Angola, and Mozambique received T-34s long after they had become obsolete by European standards. These tanks participated in some of the bloodiest conflicts of the Cold War era. During the Ogaden War between Somalia and Ethiopia in 1977–78, 40-year-old T-34s faced each other across desert battlefields, their crews often trained by rival superpowers. In Angola's civil war, Cuban forces operating Soviet T-34s fought against South African troops, creating a proxy conflict that drew in forces from 3 continents. Meanwhile, back in the Soviet Union, something unexpected was happening to the T-34s that had been kept in reserve. Soviet military planners, suspicious of Western intentions and paranoid about potential invasion, refused to scrap their entire T-34 inventory. Instead, thousands were placed in long-term storage facilities across the country. In places like Kubinka, Nizhny Tagil, and various locations in Siberia, T-34s were carefully preserved. They were coated in protective grease, their openings sealed against moisture, their fuel tanks drained and cleaned. Then they were simply parked in massive warehouses and forgotten. Soviet doctrine held that in a total war, these old tanks could be rapidly reactivated to equip reserve divisions or home defense units. These storage depots created time capsules. When Western observers finally gained access to former Soviet facilities in the 1990s, they discovered T-34s that had been mothballed in 1946 and never touched again. Some tanks had fewer than 100 engine hours, essentially factory fresh, despite being 50 years old. The preservation was so effective that several of these storage vehicles could be returned to running condition with minimal work. Museums around the world competed to acquire these perfectly preserved examples. Today, if you see a T-34 driving under its own power at a military vehicle show, there's a good chance it spent decades sleeping in a Siberian warehouse, waiting for a war that never came. Perhaps the most dramatic rediscovery occurred in 2000 when Estonian peat harvesters made an extraordinary find. Their excavator struck something metallic 6 meters below the surface of a bog near the village of Kurtna. When archaeologists investigated, they found a complete T-3476, the earlier version of the famous tank, perfectly preserved in the oxygen-free peat. The tank had crashed through the bog surface in September 1944 during the battles to drive German forces from Estonia. Its crew had escaped, but the vehicle was unrecoverable with wartime technology, so it was simply abandoned and slowly sank into the peat. The anaerobic conditions preserved everything. When the tank was lifted out, its engine oil was still liquid. The ammunition was still live. Personal effects from the crew remained in the driver's compartment: a spoon, tobacco, a photograph. After restoration, this T-34 runs today, the only known example recovered from such preservation conditions. Water claimed many T-34s as well. As Soviet forces advanced westward in 1944–45, thousands of tanks crossed rivers on improvised bridges and ferries. When bridges collapsed or ferries sank, the tanks went to the bottom. The Vistula River in Poland, the Oder in Germany, the Danube across Central Europe, all became graveyards for T-34s. In 2016, Polish divers exploring the Vistula River near Warsaw discovered what they called a tank cemetery. Sonar revealed at least 12 T-34s on the river bottom, casualties of a failed crossing in August 1944. Similar discoveries continue regularly. The Bug River, the Dnieper, the Neva near Leningrad. Each year, construction projects or changing water levels reveal tanks that have been underwater for 75 years. Some of these underwater T-34s have been recovered in remarkable condition. Cold, oxygen-poor river water acts as a preservative. In 2005, Russian recovery teams pulled a T-34 from the bottom of the Neva River, where it had rested since 1943. When opened, they found the crew's remains still at their stations, along with personal letters, photographs, and identification documents. The tank was treated as a war grave. After proper military honors for the crew, the vehicle was restored and now stands as a memorial. These underwater recoveries continue to provide historical insights. Analysis of the metal composition, manufacturing markings, and internal modifications helps historians track how Soviet production techniques evolved during the desperate war years. The strangest T-34 survival stories involve civilian repurposing. In the immediate post-war years, when scrap metal was desperately needed but transportation infrastructure was destroyed, many T-34 hulks were simply incorporated into the landscape. In Belarus and Western Russia, farmers used derelict tanks as improvised bridges over streams. Others were partially buried to serve as tool sheds or root cellars. In several Ukrainian villages, T-34 turrets were removed and inverted to create church bells. You can still hear the ring of Soviet armor calling the faithful to prayer. One collective farm near Minsk used a T-34 chassis as the foundation for a grain silo, the hull filled with concrete and built upward with brick. It served that function until 1987, when the farm was reorganized and the structure demolished, revealing the tank that had been hidden inside for 40 years. Vietnam received hundreds of T-34s during the 1950s and 60s, though they saw limited combat use. By the time major American involvement began in 1965, the T-34 was considered too vulnerable to modern anti-tank weapons and airstrikes. Most Vietnamese T-34s remained in reserve or were used for training. However, at least some participated in the final North Vietnamese offensive in 1975. Photographs from the fall of Saigon show a mixture of Soviet armor, including a few T-34s, entering the city alongside more modern T-54s and T-55s tanks. After the war, many of these T-34s were placed in parks and monuments across Vietnam. Today, they serve as jungle gyms for children who have no memory of the wars these machines fought in. Cuba presents another curious case. The island nation received approximately 60 T-34s from the Soviet Union in the early 1960s. These tanks were obsolete even by the standards of the time, but Castro's forces used them during the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. At least one T-34 participated in the fighting at Playa Girón, where it engaged CIA-backed exile forces equipped with American weapons. After the crisis, Cuba's T-34s were relegated to training duties and eventual monument status. However, intelligence reports from the 1990s suggested that Cuba maintained a small number of T-34s in working condition, kept in storage as a last-ditch home defense force. Whether any remain operational today is unclear, but Cuban military parades occasionally feature T-34s as historical exhibits. The museum and collector market for T-34s has created its own economy. Starting in the 1990s, as the Soviet Union collapsed and Eastern European nations joined NATO, thousands of old Soviet tanks flooded onto the military surplus market. T-34s in varying conditions became available to museums, private collectors, and military enthusiasts. Prices ranged from $20,000 for a rusted hull to over $100,000 for a running example. American and European collectors purchased T-34s and had them shipped overseas. Today, running T-34s participate in historical reenactments, appear in films, and are driven at military vehicle rallies. The largest concentration of T-34s outside the former Soviet Union is probably in the United States, where private collectors own dozens of examples. The film industry has kept many T-34s in working condition. Any World War II movie depicting the Eastern Front requires period-appropriate Soviet armor, and T-34s are the only authentic option. Productions like Enemy at the Gates, Stalingrad, and various Russian war epics have employed real T-34s. Film production companies and military museums have established symbiotic relationships. Museums provide running tanks for filming in exchange for maintenance costs and exposure. Some T-34s have appeared in more films than they ever participated in actual battles. One particular T-34-85, owned by a Czech museum, has fought in 17 different movies, representing both Soviet and German forces depending on how it's marked and filmed. Russia itself has maintained the largest number of T-34s in its collection. The Kubinka Tank Museum outside Moscow houses over 50 examples, representing different production variants from different factories and time periods. These range from early T-34-76 models with welded turrets to late T-34-85s with improved armor and armament. The museum uses these vehicles to trace the evolution of Soviet tank design and manufacturing. On special occasions, particularly Victory Day celebrations each May 9th, Some of these museum T-34s are driven through Moscow's Red Square in commemoration of the 1945 Victory Parade. The sight of vintage T-34s rolling past the Kremlin remains a powerful symbol of Russian military history and national pride. The archaeology of T-34s continues to reveal new information. Modern battlefields in Eastern Europe and Western Russia still contain thousands of tanks buried, burned, or abandoned. Professional archaeological teams, working with metal detectorists and local historians, continue to locate and excavate these sites. Each discovery provides data: manufacturing dates, unit markings, ammunition types, crew belongings. In 2018, excavators in the Leningrad region uncovered a T-34 buried in a mass tank grave, one of dozens pushed into a crater and covered with earth after a 1943 battle. The tank's internal contents were cataloged like an archaeological dig: 47 spent shell casings, 3 unused rounds, the crew's personal effects, and remarkably, a journal that had survived in a sealed compartment. These finds help historians understand the reality of tank warfare beyond official reports and propaganda. Some T-34s have survived in the most unlikely locations. In 2011, a Japanese military museum announced it had acquired a T-34-85 that had been captured during the brief Soviet-Japanese War in August 1945. The tank had been shipped to Japan, studied extensively by Japanese engineers, and then stored at a military research facility for over 60 years. Its existence was barely documented until the facility was decommissioned. Similarly, a T-34 was discovered in a British Army testing facility in 2003, a vehicle that had been sent to Britain in 1946 for evaluation and then simply forgotten in a warehouse for 57 years. The T-34's symbolic importance transcended its military function. During the Cold War, the tank became an icon of Soviet power and communist revolution. Countries receiving T-34s weren't just getting weapons, they were receiving symbols of alignment with Moscow. Monument T-34s appeared in capital cities across the communist bloc. These weren't running vehicles, but specially prepared tanks mounted on concrete pedestals, marking important battles or celebrating revolutionary movements. Budapest, Prague, Warsaw, Berlin, Pyongyang, Havana, dozens of cities erected T-34 monuments. After the Soviet Union collapsed, many of these monuments became politically controversial. Some were removed, relocated, or vandalized. Others remain awkward relics of a vanished ideology. Afghanistan saw T-34 action decades after they should have been retired. When Soviet forces invaded Afghanistan in 1979, they encountered Mujahideen fighters equipped with old T-34s that had been supplied to the Afghan government in the 1950s. The irony was profound. Soviet soldiers fighting against their own obsolete tanks in the hands of insurgents. The T-34s performed poorly in Afghanistan's mountain warfare. Too heavy for poor roads, too slow to catch insurgents, too vulnerable to modern anti-tank weapons. Most were destroyed or abandoned. Today, wrecked T-34s rust in Afghan valleys alongside more modern Soviet armor, a timeline of military technology written in corroding steel. The environmental legacy of 84,000 tanks is considerable. Each T-34 contained lubricants, hydraulic fluids, fuel residue, and various chemicals. When thousands were scrapped, these substances leached into soil and water. Former tank parks and scrapyards in Eastern Europe still show elevated levels of heavy metal contamination. The explosive demolition of tanks scattered fragments across wide areas. In Germany and Poland, farmers still occasionally plow up T-34 parts, track links, armor plates, shell casings. These fragments are collected by metal detectorists and military relic hunters, creating a gray market in tank parts and memorabilia. Modern military forces occasionally still encounter old T-34s in active service. During the Syrian civil war, photographs emerged showing Syrian government forces operating T-34-85 tanks against rebel positions. These vehicles, supplied to Syria in the 1950s and presumed long retired, had been pulled from storage depots and pressed into service. Their effectiveness was minimal. They were easily destroyed by modern anti-tank weapons and served more as mobile pillboxes than maneuverable armor. Similarly, reports from Yemen in 2015 indicated that Houthi rebels had captured and attempted to use T-34s they found in old Yemeni army bases. These may represent some of the last instances of T-34s being used in actual combat, nearly 70 years after their design. Private ownership of T-34s raises interesting legal questions. In most countries, demilitarized tanks can be owned by civilians, but the definition of demilitarized varies. In Russia, collectors must prove the main gun is permanently disabled. In the United States, the gun can remain functional if properly registered with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. Several American owners possess fully operational T-34s with working main guns, though ammunition is obviously restricted. One Texas collector made headlines in 2008 when he drove his T-34 to a local restaurant, creating traffic chaos and a police response. He was eventually permitted to drive it home, as Texas law contains no specific prohibition against operating a tank on public roads. The T-34 production facilities themselves tell a story of survival and transformation. The main T-34 factory in Nizhny Tagil continued building tanks long after World War II ended, eventually producing T-54s, T-55s, and later Soviet models. The factory operates today as Uralvagonzavod, building Russia's current T-90 and T-14 Armata tanks. The facility has a museum displaying T-34s built at that location during different periods of the war, showing how production techniques evolved under pressure. You can trace the war's progression through manufacturing details. Cruder welding from 1941 to 42, when the factory was overwhelmed, more refined work from 1944 to 45, when production stabilized. Scuba diving to see underwater T-34s has become a niche tourism activity in Eastern Europe. Dive operators in Poland and Russia offer expeditions to explore river-bottom tank sites. These aren't salvage operations, but underwater archaeology, with tanks left in place as historical sites. Divers describe the eerie experience of descending to find a T-34 sitting on the riverbed, its hatches still open, aquatic plants growing through the turret. Fish shelter inside the hulls. Silt slowly covers everything. In another 50 years, many will be completely buried and impossible to locate without advanced sonar. The last T-34s were finally retired from active military service in the early 2000s. Some African and Asian nations maintained small numbers into the 1990s, but by 2000, virtually no military organization listed the T-34 as an operational asset. The exceptions were a handful of vehicles kept running for ceremonial purposes, or as museum exhibits. This marked the end of a 60-year operational life, an extraordinarily long service period for any weapon system. For comparison, most modern tanks are considered obsolete after 30 years. The T-34's longevity speaks to the robustness of its design and the desperation of nations too poor to replace it. Restoration of derelict T-34s has become a specialized skill. Master restorers can look at a rust-encrusted hull half buried in a forest and determine if it's salvageable. The process is painstaking, removing decades of corrosion, sourcing authentic parts, rebuilding engines, restoring optics, repainting in historically accurate colors. A complete restoration can take thousands of hours and cost upward of $200,000. The result is a functioning piece of history, a machine that can move and operate exactly as it did in 1945. Restored T-34s command premium prices from museums and collectors, creating an economic incentive to locate and recover abandoned vehicles. The philosophical question remains, what do we owe these machines? They are, after all, instruments of war designed to kill. Yet they also represent liberation for millions who suffered under Nazi occupation. They embody the industrial achievement of a nation fighting for survival. They are monuments to the soldiers who died inside them. The conflicting meanings make T-34 preservation controversial. In Eastern Europe, some view them as symbols of Soviet oppression. In Russia, they're icons of the Great Patriotic War's victory. The debate over what these tanks mean reflects larger arguments about history, memory, and national identity. Today, approximately 1,500 T-34s survive in various conditions worldwide. About 200 are in running condition. The rest are museum exhibits, monuments, or derelict hulks awaiting restoration or scrapping. From 84,000 produced, this represents a survival rate of less than 2%. Each survivor tells a story. The museum piece that was carefully preserved, the monument that stood in a city square for 70 years, the wreck pulled from a river, the time capsule discovered in a barn. Taken together, these surviving T-34s form a scattered memorial to the largest tank force in history. The T-34's journey from mass-produced war machine to historical artifact mirrors the larger transformation of World War II from lived experience to distant history. The men who drove these tanks, who loaded their guns and fired at enemy armor, who died inside their steel shells, all have passed or soon will. The machines outlive them, metal and mechanical memory persisting after human memory fades. Walking around a T-34 today, you can run your hand along armor that deflected German shells, peer through vision slits that framed battlefields now returned to farmland, touch controls manipulated by men whose names we'll never know. These tanks, whether displayed in museums or rusting in fields, whether preserved in climate-controlled buildings or slowly dissolving underwater, are the last physical witnesses to a world consumed by total war and somehow reborn from its ashes.